How did the Germans live the war that turned Europe into ashes? What did they think? What did they feel? What did they see from inside a country that went from euphoria to the abyss in barely 6 years? This is the complete story of the Second World War, from the German perspective, from the early days of blind confidence to the final collapse amid rubble and silence. What you are going to hear is not a justification. It is a journey through the collective mind of a nation that believed it was writing its destiny and ended up destroying itself. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor in January 1933, Germany was still conditioned by the impositions of the Treaty of Versailles, which had limited the military capacity of the country after the defeat of 1918. The German army, which under that agreement was called the Reichswehr, was restricted to 100,000 soldiers, without tanks, without heavy artillery, without combat aviation, and with a navy reduced to small-sized ships. The prohibition of a formal general staff forced a camouflage of military planning structures under organizations with other names, and weapons production was subjected to a strict international vigilance. However, since before Hitler came to power, there existed in the military commands and in nationalist sectors a clear purpose to overcome these limitations and rebuild the war potential. What changed with the arrival of the National Socialist regime was the speed, the scale, and the political decision to transform those aspirations into concrete facts. In the first months of his government, Hitler presented his rise as the beginning of a new era for Germany. The propaganda insisted that the people had recovered a strong leadership and that the country had to free itself from the humiliation imposed by the victors of the Great War. Although in appearance Germany continued respecting the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, in reality discrete measures began to be taken to boost a rearmament that developed under administrative covers and public work programs. In these first steps, the objective was to avoid direct clashes with the Western powers, while the ground was prepared for a greater military expansion. But how did Germany manage to rearm its army without the European powers reacting in time? What secret mechanisms were used to evade international controls? The answer reveals a combination of audacity, deceit, and unexpected collaboration. Clandestine rearmament was not a totally new phenomenon, since from the time of the Weimar Republic, secret links had been maintained with the Soviet Union that allowed weapons testing in Russian territory, far from international supervision. However, under the government of Hitler, these practices were expanded and integrated into a coherent plan that linked economic reconstruction with war preparation. The creation of employment in weapons factories and in public works was presented as a social policy, but in practice it meant the development of an industrial infrastructure ready to sustain military production. A decisive point arrived in 1935, when Hitler announced in an open manner the introduction of compulsory military service, with which the Reichswehr was transformed into the Wehrmacht. The army went on to organize itself into divisions of greater size, and the formation of armored and motorized units began. That same year, the existence of the Luftwaffe was officially proclaimed, which had already been developing in secret, and massive resources were invested in the creation of a modern military aviation. The Kriegsmarine, although more limited for budgetary and strategic reasons, also initiated an expansion process with new submarines and plans for a stronger surface fleet. The Heer, as the land army was denominated, was the first to expand. From the 100,000 soldiers allowed by Versailles, it went to a force that in a few years reached several millions. Infantry, panzer, and motorized divisions were organized, which gave the army a flexibility and a mobility superior to those of the previous war. The officer schools were reactivated and doctrines were developed that sought to avoid the war of positions that had characterized the conflict from 1914 to 1918. In its place, the idea of a rapid war was promoted in which the armored vehicles and the aviation would play a central role. The Luftwaffe, under the direction of Hermann Göring, became one of the most visible symbols of the new German military power. From its first years, it focused on the production of fighters, like the Messerschmitt Bf 109, dive bombers like the Junkers Ju 87 Stuka, and medium bombers like the Heinkel Heer 111. These models were designed not only to match the capacity of other powers, but to give shape to a style of war in which the aviation would directly support the ground forces, striking enemy concentrations and disorganizing their defenses. The Luftwaffe did not be born as an independent weapon of a strategic character, but as an integral part of a lightning war plan. The Kriegsmarine, for its part, faced greater limitations. Germany could not compete in number of ships with the British Royal Navy, which is why a development centered on submarines, the U-boots, was opted for. In 1935, a naval agreement was signed with Great Britain that in theory fixed limits to the German fleet, but which in practice was utilised as justification to expand naval construction. The most ambitious plan, known as Plan Z, foresaw the construction of large battleships and aircraft carriers, although upon the outbreak of the war, only a part of that programme had been completed. Meanwhile, the U-boots offered an asymmetrical war tool capable of threatening enemy supply routes in case of conflict. The development of this military machinery was accompanied by a doctrinal framework that sought to avoid the mistakes of the previous war. The experience of the trenches and the stagnation had left in the German officers the conviction that the next conflict had to be resolved with rapidity and with a coordinated use of all the available means. Thus was born the idea of the Blitzkrieg or lightning war, which was not a single plan codified in a manual, but a set of principles that gave priority to surprise, speed, and coordination between arms. The army had to penetrate the enemy lines with tanks and motorized troops, while the aviation destroyed key points and disorganized the rearguard. The infantry would advance behind to consolidate the gained positions. This combination intended to destabilize the adversary from the first moment and prevent it from having time to reorganize. The Blitzkrieg represented a rupture with the classic vision of the war of attrition. Instead of trusting in the accumulation of forces to slowly wear down the enemy, it was about achieving a rapid collapse of its resistance capacity. This demanded meticulous planning, efficient logistics, and a coordination between branches that until then had not been seen on that scale. Although still in the second half of the decade of the 30s, the Wehrmacht was in full formation process and lacked many of the necessary resources. The doctrine was consolidating as the base upon which officers and troops trained. In the political terrain, Hitler combined these measures with a public discourse that kept speaking of peace and of a fair revision of the international order, while in practice, he directed all the resources of the state towards rearmament. Financial mechanisms were utilized, such as the so-called Mefo-Wechsel, bills of exchange issued by a fictitious company that allowed financing the production of weaponry, without it appearing in the official budgets. This financial engineering hid the real rhythm of the rearmament, avoiding an immediate economic collapse and permitting at the same time a massive military expansion. The organization of the economy adjusted to the needs of the army. Heavy industry, steel production, and research into new fuels and synthetic materials were put under state control. Agriculture was also adapted to the forecasts of autarky, seeking to assure the supply of food in case of war. The 4-year plan launched in 1936 was the clearest expression of this policy. Its objective was to prepare Germany for war in a brief period, reducing the dependence on imports and assuring the capacity to sustain a prolonged conflict. The German military command, although on occasions it showed reservations faced with the rhythm imposed by Hitler, aligned progressively with these objectives. Generals who had lived the First World War understood the risks of a premature conflict, but the authority of the regime and the initial successes of the foreign policy reinforced the confidence that Germany could face Europe once again. The army, which in the years of Weimar had sought to maintain a discreet profile, went on to be the central pillar of a state that conceived itself as a militarized community. On the international plane, these measures generated disquiet in the neighboring powers, but the policy of appeasement and the desire to avoid a new war permitted Germany to keep expanding its capacities without encountering an immediate opposition. Thus, upon arriving at 1939, the Wehrmacht had become a force of several millions of soldiers, equipped with modern divisions, and numerous aviation and a navy in the process of expansion. What had begun as a rearmament, disguised as a social program, transformed into a war machinery ready to be utilized. And what was the pretext that the regime needed to unleash that machinery? How was the beginning of a war that would forever change the course of history justified to the German people and to the world? Since the spring of 1939, the German high commands no longer discussed whether Poland should be attacked, but when to do it. The planning began to take concrete shape since April, when Hitler gave instructions to prepare a rapid and forceful action against the eastern neighbour. The objective was not exclusively military. It was about imposing a definitive solution to the Polish problem, which for the regime was as much territorial as ideological. The directives were clear: eliminate the defensive capacity of Poland from the first day, destroy its administrative structures, and make clear that it was not about a temporary campaign or of partial occupation. For that, the German army needed a meticulous organisation. In the middle of the year, the plans were finalised for what would be the fastest campaign that Europe had seen until then. The forces concentrated in various strategic border points. The Wehrmacht disposed of overwhelming forces. Around 1.5 million soldiers, almost 2,500 tanks, and more than 2,000 airplanes were ready to participate in the offensive. This mobilisation included the Heer, the Luftwaffe, and the Kriegsmarine, although this last one played a more limited role due to the terrestrial nature of the conflict. The tactical preparations included strong coordination between the ground and air forces. The concept of lightning war, which had already been developing in previous years, found in this operation its first scenario of practical application. Although it was not a formally established doctrine, as it would be later, the idea of combining rapid, deep, and well-synchronized attacks with an intensive use of aviation was key. The Panzer divisions, supported by tactical aviation, would seek to penetrate into the interior of the country as rapidly as possible, avoiding conventional defensive lines and sowing confusion in the enemy rearguard. The regime not only prepared the military aspect. Since weeks before the attack, a propagandistic apparatus was set in motion to justify the action. Messages were elaborated that presented Poland as a potential aggressor, and border incidents were exaggerated to generate an atmosphere of imminent threat. One of the best-known setups was the Gleiwitz incident, an undercover operation executed by German forces disguised as Poles that simulated an attack on a German radio station. This event was presented to the world as a Polish provocation and served as the immediate pretext to launch the offensive. At 4:45 in the morning on the 1st of September of 1939, the attack began. The Luftwaffe bombarded strategic positions in the interior of Poland, including aerodromes, communication centres, and military warehouses. Almost at the same time, the ground units crossed the border on multiple fronts, with enveloping movements that sought to disorganise the enemy from the first minutes. The panzer divisions advanced at great speed, flanked by motorised infantry that secured the conquered areas. The attack was fulminating. In a matter of days, the Polish defences began to collapse. The German forces did not stop at the points of resistance, but surrounded them and continued towards the interior, leaving to the rearguard the tasks of clean-up and consolidation. This strategy permitted a continuous advance without wearing down the forces in prolonged confrontations. The Polish units, although they offered resistance at diverse points, could not coordinate efficiently, nor establish a coherent defensive line. Furthermore, the German air supremacy hindered any attempt at reorganisation or counterattack. Meanwhile, the propaganda inside Germany disseminated the idea of a preventive, necessary and just operation. The presumed abuses committed by Poland against German minorities in its territory were highlighted, and the Reich was presented as a victim forced to defend itself. The speeches of Hitler constantly repeated this narrative, assuring that every diplomatic route had been exhausted and that the attack was an inevitable response to the Polish provocations. In the newsreels, carefully selected images were shown of smiling soldiers, columns advancing without opposition, and populations that supposedly welcomed the German troops with pleasure. The coordination between the distinct branches of the army was refined in real time. The mobile divisions kept communicating their progress and requested air support when they encountered resistance. The Luftwaffe responded with rapidity, eliminating obstacles and permitting the advance not to stop. This vertiginous rhythm surprised not only the Poles, but also international observers. In a few days, the German forces were deep inside enemy territory, surrounding Warsaw and other key cities. On the diplomatic plane, Germany previously assured that the Soviet Union would not intervene in favour of Poland. This was possible thanks to the pact signed in August between both powers, officially known as a non-aggression pact, but which included secret clauses about the partition of the Polish territory. With this agreement, Hitler eliminated the risk of a war on two fronts and could concentrate exclusively on the Eastern campaign. Furthermore, he trusted that France and Great Britain would not react with firmness, just as had happened in previous episodes. However, the diplomatic calculation was not entirely accurate. On September 3rd, France and the United Kingdom declared war on Germany in fulfillment of their commitments to Poland. Despite this, no immediate military action was produced on the part of these powers. For weeks, the so-called phony war installed itself in the West, with minimal defensive movements and without significant combats. This permitted Germany to continue its offensive, without worrying about a second front. Within German territory, the news of the war was received with a mixture of enthusiasm and resignation. The propaganda had prepared the ground, presenting the conflict as a just and necessary cause. Many citizens supported the action, convinced that it was the only way to resolve the pending problems with Poland. At the same time, measures of censorship and information control were activated to assure a single narrative and avoid dissident voices. Values like sacrifice, discipline, and national pride were promoted, while casualties were minimized and the crudest aspects of the conflict were hidden. The campaign was brief, but intense. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded the east of Poland, fulfilling what was agreed with Germany. This accelerated even more the disintegration of the Polish army, which was already in retreat. Warsaw resisted until the end of the month, but finally capitulated after a siege accompanied by constant bombardments. The Polish resistance was brave in many cases, but completely overwhelmed by the technical and organizational superiority of the enemy. By the end of September, the map of Europe had changed. Poland was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, and the world had formally entered into war. For the Nazi regime, the campaign was a demonstration of military efficiency, strategic planning, and political control. It was confirmed that the model of rapid war worked, and this reinforced the confidence of the High Command in future operations. Blitzkrieg was not yet a familiar word for the public, but its essence had been put into practice with brutal efficiency. The experience of Poland became a model to follow. The generals studied every detail of the operation to refine the mechanisms in future campaigns. The political authorities highlighted the results as proof of the superiority of the German system. Parades were organized, victory bulletins were broadcasted, and the figure of the German soldier was glorified. The initial success reinforced the idea that the Reich possessed an inevitable and justified expansionist destiny, and that obstacles would be overcome with the same rapidity and determination as in this first campaign. But what would happen when that model faced more prepared enemies, with more resources, and with a stronger will of resistance? Could the Blitzkrieg repeat itself indefinitely? The German military strategy in 1940 focused on taking advantage of speed and coordination as main tools to win. After the campaign in Poland, the German army directed its attention towards the west, with the objective of conquering France and its allies. through an offensive that would break with the traditional methods of war of attrition. The concept of blitzkrieg, which had already shown its efficacy in Polish territory, was applied now on an even larger scale and with a precision that took the Western powers by surprise. The idea was simple but devastating: rapid, deep and coordinated penetrations by air and land to disorganize the enemy before it could react. In May of that year, the Wehrmacht launched its attack on the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg, nations that saw themselves wrapped in the German military machinery as part of the plan to outflank the French defences. The Maginot Line, constructed by France to resist an invasion from the east, became useless when the German forces avoided facing it directly and instead crossed the Ardennes, a forested region considered poorly viable for massive movements. This tactical choice was key. The panzer divisions managed to open breaches rapidly, pushing the Allied forces towards the north and separating them from their rearguard. The Netherlands could not resist for much time. The German advance, accompanied by intense bombardments, provoked the rapid collapse of the Dutch army. Rotterdam was bombarded as a warning, and the threat of total destruction forced the surrender. The velocity of the offensive and the brutality of the impact paralysed any possibility of coordinated response. Belgium, which had also tried to remain neutral, was equally surpassed. The Belgian, British and French forces tried to form a defensive line, but the German manoeuvres, well calculated and backed by an unprecedented mobility, enveloped them before they could establish a firm front. The most decisive operation was the advance through Sedan. There the Germans managed to cross the Meuse River with rapidity, overcoming the French defences. Once that crossing was achieved, the armoured divisions launched themselves towards the west, in the direction of the English Channel, encircling the Allied forces in Belgium and northern France. The rapidity of the movement left the Allied commands without time to regroup, provoking a collapse in morale and in the command structure. Dunkirk then became the only point of escape. While the British forces and part of the French army were trapped against the coast, an emergency evacuation was organised. Although the Germans could have closed the encirclement, they stopped briefly by decision of the High Command, which permitted hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers to escape by sea. This tactical pause still generates debate, but it did not change the general course of the campaign. France was left divided, and its forces were outrun. The government crumbled before the velocity of the German advance. Paris was occupied without the need for prolonged combats, and in June the country requested an armistice. The victory was total from the military point of view, with a rapidity that completely broke with the memories of the First World War. The success of the Blitzkrieg was not only operational, but also propagandistic. In Germany, the regime took advantage of this victory to reinforce the image of invincibility of the new German army and the superiority of the National Socialist system. The images of the parade in Paris and the reports of the advances were broadcast widely on the radio and in the newsreels. Hitler appeared as a brilliant leader who had surpassed the old powers, while the generals were presented as admired national figures. This narrative strengthened the internal cohesion of the country. The population, still with fresh memories of the defeat in the Great War and the humiliations of the Treaty of Versailles, lived this moment as a historical revenge. Morale rose to unprecedented levels, and trust in the political and military leadership consolidated. The idea was installed that the Reich could impose itself in Europe with a mixture of force, rapidity, and determination. On the military plane, the campaign served as a complete validation of the German model. The armoured units that operated in combination with the aviation and their efficient logistical support demonstrated that wars could be resolved in weeks, not in years. The Luftwaffe played a fundamental role, weakening enemy forces and facilitating ground movements. The German commands observed with satisfaction how their doctrine materialized, with precision and effectiveness. Unified command, tactical surprise and mobility were decisive factors. The enemy, trapped in rigid defensive strategies and slower command structures, could not adapt to the rhythm of the offensive. This difference in focus marked the result of the campaign. Press reports spoke of the technical ability and bravery of the German soldiers, without mentioning the level of coordination that operation required. The errors committed or the wasted opportunities, like in Dunkirk, were also omitted. Everything was presented as part of a perfect and calculated sequence. The narrative was clear. The new German army, rejuvenated and professionalized, was invincible. German cities celebrated the victory with parades, speeches, and a national exultation that left behind the years of crisis. A sensation of renewed power consolidated, that history was being rewritten with success, and that the new Germany had completely overcome its recent past. The German high commands, for their part, drew very concrete conclusions. The success of the Blitzkrieg was interpreted as a repeatable formula, not as a favourable exception. This optimism directly influenced the planning of subsequent operations. It was assumed that applying the same logic, any front could collapse with adequate pressure. This confidence in tactical superiority would be a determining factor in future decisions, both in the East as in other scenarios. The campaign of France not only expanded the territorial control of the Reich, but transformed the perception of the conflict. For many within the regime, that victory confirmed the idea that the destiny of Europe was in German hands, and that velocity and will were sufficient to defeat any enemy. The morale of the army was at its highest point. The experience of a campaign so successful, rapid, and apparently clean contrasted with the memories of the previous conflict, in which every metre of ground cost thousands of lives. Now the divisions returned as conquerors, admired and decorated. The sensation that the new type of war could impose itself without attrition reinforced both the internal structure of command and the confidence of the political leadership. This collective euphoria, built upon a lightning victory, consolidated the myth of invincibility. From the logistical point of view, the success was also interpreted as proof that the German war system could operate beyond its borders with efficiency. Supply, equipment repairs, and the continuous movement of troops functioned without significant interruptions. This reinforced the idea that the Reich could sustain prolonged operations and maintain control of the offensive rhythm. The army, the population, and the leaders shared a unified vision. The model worked, the strategy was effective, and the war could be won. This internal consensus was fueled by propaganda, which left no room for doubt. Everything pointed towards a continuous expansion. Every step taken in 1940 seemed to confirm that the combination of political decision, technical capacity, and offensive doctrine was sufficient to conquer Europe. The reality of a victory so rapid, obtained with so little apparent resistance, emboldened both the command and the people. Thus, at the close of that year, Germany found itself at the peak of its confidence. The myth of the Blitzkrieg, now fueled by facts, defined the course of the conflict and set the tone for what would come next. But was there any limit to this strategy? Did there exist an enemy capable of resisting the German pressure and exposing the weaknesses of a model that until then seemed perfect? After the rapid German victories in Western Europe, Hitler ordered the army to prepare a plan to invade the United Kingdom. This operation received the name Operation Sea Lion. It was expected to be a natural continuation of the success obtained in France. However, this time the scenario was different. It was not an immediate ground offensive, but an invasion that required mastering first the air and maritime space. The German command knew that it could not land troops on British soil without first neutralizing the Royal Air Force. Therefore, the High Command ordered the Luftwaffe to completely eliminate the aerial defensive capacity of the United Kingdom before fixing a definitive date for the landing. The Luftwaffe counted on broad experience after its previous campaigns and possessed the conviction that it would achieve its objectives without major difficulties. At the beginning of the aerial offensive, they focused on bombing military objectives like aerodromes, radar stations, and communication lines. The purpose was to weaken the British defences in a systematic manner. The attacks began in July of 1940 and intensified in August. Every day, hundreds of flights were launched that crossed the Channel to attack the islands. However, the British had prepared a defence network more solid than the Germans expected. Besides counting on an early warning system by radar, the British pilots operated close to their bases, while the Germans had to fly long distances, which limited their combat time. The German tactical superiority that had worked in ground campaigns did not translate easily to aerial combat. Although the Luftwaffe possessed a large quantity of airplanes, its bombers were slow and vulnerable. The fighters in charge of escorting them had a limited range, which is why many times they could not accompany them until the end of the journey. This left the bombers exposed to the attacks of the British fighters, who took advantage of that weakness to shoot down a great quantity of enemy aircraft. Despite the losses, the Germans continued with their offensive, changing objectives and adapting their strategy. During some weeks, they attacked the radar installations strongly, hoping to blind the British defence. Then they focused on destroying the aviation fields, attempting to leave the RAF without response capacity. Seeing that the Royal Air Force resisted more than expected, the Luftwaffe adopted a new focus. At the beginning of September, the bombardments were directed towards the main cities, especially London. This decision did not respond only to a military necessity. It was also sought to provoke fear, break the morale of the population, and force a surrender. But this new tactic did not fulfill its objectives. Although they caused destruction and civilian victims, the British resistance did not weaken. On the contrary, the population adapted to the attacks, and the British propaganda strengthened the collective spirit. The authorities distributed gas masks, organised shelters, and established evacuation systems for the children. Meanwhile, the British pilots continued facing the Germans, many times in numerical inferiority, but with a closer knowledge of the terrain and an immediate support network. The German High Command, not seeing clear results, began to question the efficacy of its actions. Although at the beginning they had shown themselves sure of a rapid aerial victory, with the passing of the weeks, the confidence began to diminish. The figures of airplane losses were ever higher, and production could not compensate for the attrition. Furthermore, experienced pilots began to become scarce. In contrast, the RAF managed to replace its airplanes more rapidly thanks to its industrial system adapted to the war and external help. The British fighters, like the Spitfire and the Hurricane, demonstrated themselves to be effective, and the squadrons were rotated to avoid exhaustion. The situation became even more tense when intelligence reports began to show that the aerial offensive was not fulfilling the planned objectives. The key installations of the British defence remained operational. The aviation fields were repaired rapidly, and the production of airplanes had not stopped. Instead of weakening the RAF, the campaign seemed to strengthen its determination. This forced the German authorities to reconsider the viability of the ground invasion. Although Sea Lion was not officially cancelled, it was postponed indefinitely, and the assigned units began to be relocated for other tasks. Hitler, who until that moment had trusted in a favourable outcome, accepted that the United Kingdom would not fall through a rapid aerial offensive. The failure had a strong impact on the internal perception of the conflict. In Germany, the propaganda had been in charge of showing the military advances as inevitable. Every victory was announced as a proof of national superiority. The offensive against the United Kingdom was presented as one more step towards the consolidation of the new European order. However, when it became evident that the objective would not be reached, the tone began to change. Official communications reduced attention on the campaign in England and began to highlight other topics. The media stopped talking about the imminent British collapse and began to present the bombardment as a measure of punishment or as part of a prolonged blockade. This change did not go unnoticed by the population, which had been accustomed to a narrative of constant advances. Internally, the German command sought reasons to explain the failure. Some blamed the bad weather, others the lack of coordination between the branches of the armed forces. There were also criticisms of the strategy adopted by Göring, who had promised that the Luftwaffe would achieve total control of the air without the need for naval support. His confidence in the capacity of his pilots and planes was not reflected in the results. The divisions within the military leadership began to become more visible. Despite the experience accumulated in previous campaigns, this was the first time that the German army did not achieve its objectives immediately. The aerial conflict with the United Kingdom marked a turning point. Although it did not stop the German war machinery, it did show that there were limits to its advance. The failure in the British sky also had technical consequences. The commands began to rethink the design of bombers, looking for models with greater range and defensive capacity. Escort systems, coordination between squadrons, and supply logistics were evaluated. In parallel, alternative plans for future campaigns began to be developed. The authorities understood that they could not depend exclusively on one tactic or one type of weapon. While the Blitzkrieg had been effective on land, in the air it required adaptations that had not been foreseen. The British experience demonstrated that an enemy with good technical preparation and a will to resist could alter the course of the war. Another important aspect was the response of the German population. Although there was no complete information about the results, it was perceived that something had changed. The indefinite suspension of the ground invasion and the growing silence in the media generated uncertainty. The propaganda tried to maintain morale by speaking of a future victory or a diplomatic solution. But for the first time since the beginning of the conflict, doubts appeared about the infallibility of the leadership. Some voices began to ask themselves if the United Kingdom would be an obstacle more complex than foreseen. These concerns did not manifest themselves openly, but they were signs that the initial enthusiasm was beginning to moderate. With time, the conflict with the United Kingdom was left in the background. Strategic priorities changed, and it was decided to focus efforts on other fronts. Even so, the aerial battle left a permanent mark on military conduct. It was a lesson on the limits of aviation, on the importance of logistics, and on the capacity of the enemy to adapt. Although the German command tried to present the campaign as a partial success, in practice it was a setback. The fact of not having managed to defeat the RAF, nor open the way for a direct invasion, prevented the Third Reich from consolidating its total dominion over Western Europe. The Battle of Britain was an episode in which the aerial strategy showed its weaknesses. Unlike ground offensives, where the conquered terrain offered visible results, in the air everything depended on coordination, timing, and their enemy's capacity to respond. The Luftwaffe discovered that it was not enough to possess more airplanes or previous experience. The combination of technical, tactical, and human factors determined the outcome. The British managed to maintain their airspace, resist the pressure, and preserve their operational capacity. And that meant that Hitler's most ambitious plan up to that moment, to conquer the United Kingdom, would not be realised. The aerial offensive over England was not only a strategic setback, it was also the first moment in which the German military machinery found an obstacle that it could not overcome in the expected time. The consequences were evident in the redesign of plans, in the reorientation of resources, and in the internal perception of the conflict. The war would not be as fast or as unilateral as had been imagined. This episode demonstrated that organised resistance, combined with adequate technology and firm morale, could stop even an enemy that until then seemed invincible. The experience of that summer changed the rhythm of the conflict, and although the Reich continued advancing on other fronts, it would no longer do so with the same certainty of immediate victory. What if Hitler's true objective was never in England, but a much larger enemy in the East? What led Germany to launch itself against the Soviet Union in the most massive operation of military history? After the rapid and crushing triumph in Western Europe, the next strategic objective of the German command was already clearly outlined. For months, even before the fall of France, Hitler had expressed in closed circles his decision to initiate a new campaign towards the East. In his calculations, the confrontation with the Soviet Union was not a remote possibility, nor a response to foreign provocations. It was a necessary step to secure the vital space that Germany, according to the regime's vision, had to conquer and dominate. This idea, which came from afar, found itself closely linked to the concepts of Lebensraum and anti-communism. The East, populated by Slavs considered racially inferior, had to be subjugated, its resources appropriated, and its lands colonized. Soviet communism, for its part, represented not only a rival ideology, but also an existential enemy that had to be destroyed at its roots. The planning of this operation began systematically after the summer of 1940. Even though at that moment, Great Britain had not yet been defeated and remained an unresolved military problem, the High Command began to prepare invasion plans for the USSR. In December of that year, Hitler signed Directive No. 21, known as Operation Barbarossa. In it, it was explicitly established that the Wehrmacht had to be prepared to initiate an offensive in the East before May 15, 1941. The instruction was clear. It had to be a rapid campaign that dismantled the Red Army before it could retreat or mobilize its reserves. It was proposed as a short, decisive, and fulminating war, similar to previous campaigns in the West, but on a much larger scale. The logistical deployment was immense. 3 large army groups would be responsible for advancing over a front of almost 3,000 kilometers. Army Group North was to direct itself towards Leningrad, Army Group Center towards Moscow, and Army Group South towards Ukraine. To these were added auxiliary forces from allies like Romania, Finland, and Hungary. The whole formed the largest military operation ever organized up to that moment. More than 3 million German soldiers were mobilized, accompanied by hundreds of thousands of horses, thousands of tanks, cannons, and vehicles of all types. Preparations were carried out under a mantle of partial secrecy. Although the volume of troops did not go unnoticed, the Soviet government did not react immediately, perhaps trusting in the non-aggression pact signed in 1939. On June 22, 1941, early in the morning, the invasion was officially launched. The troops crossed the eastern border without prior declaration of war. Heavy artillery and aviation initiated a series of simultaneous bombardments against Soviet aerodromes, command centers, and depots. The Luftwaffe managed to destroy a significant amount of enemy aircraft on the ground during the first hours, which allowed securing German aerial superiority in almost all sectors. As the tanks and motorized units advanced, the infantry divisions followed behind, securing the occupied territories. The surprise was total. The Red Army, poorly prepared and disorganized, offered no effective resistance in the first days. Many Soviet units were surrounded and destroyed before being able to react. Communication lines collapsed, and chaos spread through intermediate commands. In a few weeks, the Germans had penetrated hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners. Cities and towns were falling one after another. Army Group North advanced rapidly towards the Baltic, taking Riga and approaching Leningrad. Army Group Center starred in the greatest pocket of annihilation in Belarus, around Minsk, and later in Smolensk. Army Group South, although with greater difficulties due to geography and resistance, managed to advance through Ukraine and approach Kiev. From Berlin, the tone of the regime was one of total confidence. Propaganda disseminated an image of absolute control, presenting the campaign as another demonstration of the invincible power of the Wehrmacht. They spoke of a crusade against Bolshevism, of a civilizing enterprise, and of a necessary preventive war. Official bulletins highlighted the number of captured prisoners, the speed of the advance, and the apparent weakness of the enemy. It was assured that the total collapse of the USSR was a matter of weeks. In printed and radio media, maps showed the new territories under German control, and official high command communiques spoke of non-stop victories. The population received these messages with a mixture of enthusiasm, relief, and a certain sensation of historical fatalism. For many Germans, the war in the East was not a simple continuation of previous conflicts, but a definitive struggle. Within the High Command, however, there were nuances. Although an attitude of optimism generally predominated, some officers expressed doubts about the logistical capacity to maintain the offensive momentum on such a broad front. Supply difficulties, vehicle wear, and the need to secure rear lines were constant themes of concern. The speed of the advance was at the same time its main strength and its greatest risk. Every kilometre gained distanced the units from their supply centres. Furthermore, the Soviet resistance, although chaotic at first, began to reorganise in some sectors. At certain points on the front, enemy troops offered a more cohesive defence, slowing the German advance. Despite those indications, during the first months of the campaign, the numbers remained impressive. In the initial operations, more than 500,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in various pockets, like those of Minsk, Smolensk, and Uman. The territory under German control grew rapidly. The panzer divisions opened deep breaches in enemy lines, enveloping large contingents and provoking constant ruptures. The German command considered that a couple more blows were enough to force the fall of Moscow and disintegrate the Soviet command capacity. The strategy remained based on the premise of a short war, and within that framework, military objectives were prioritized above systematic occupation of the terrain. During the following weeks, the situation remained favorable for the invaders. The front continued expanding towards the east, and German troops reached the Dnieper, the Dvina, and other key natural lines. Specialized engineering units built bridges and repaired railways to facilitate the advance. Fallen cities were taken rapidly, and on many occasions found partially evacuated. The fear of the German enemy had spread among the local population. Although the occupation orders were marked by ideological hostility, the focus of the military command remained centered on securing the terrain and advancing. The triumphalist discourse remained intact in Berlin. Hitler's public declarations reflected the conviction that the campaign was in its final stretch. The idea that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay seemed confirmed by the lack of an effective defense. In the first months, the message was reinforced that communism would be eradicated and that history was witnessing a fundamental transformation of the continent. The propagandistic machinery intensified its activity, presenting the soldiers as bearers of a new era. Images in newsreels showed tanks crossing infinite plains, German flags waving in distant towns, and maps where the front line moved towards Moscow at a constant rhythm. The sentiment in Germany was, in its majority, of confidence. The population, accustomed to hearing good news for almost 2 years, assumed that this new campaign would be another demonstration of superiority. The figures offered in communications fed that perception. Every bulletin informed of thousands more prisoners, of cities taken, and of new advances. Posters and publications showed the Red Army as a disorganized, archaic force, without capacity to react. Even those who harbored personal doubts about the duration of the conflict preferred not to manifest them openly. Social pressure, censorship, and the collective desire for victory maintained the cohesion of the official discourse. Meanwhile, troops kept penetrating into vast Soviet territory. The strategic objective of reaching Moscow before winter was maintained as a priority. The advance did not stop, and although ever greater obstacles began to emerge, the conviction that victory was near kept predominating in the high command. Decisions were made with the idea of a brief campaign, without contemplating prolonged scenarios. A war of attrition was not foreseen. The conviction was that the USSR would collapse, just as other countries had done in the past. The message was clear. Operation Barbarossa was presented as a logical, inevitable, and justified enterprise. Propaganda left no room for ambiguities. It was about a fight for the survival of Germany against an ideological, racial, and military enemy. Every step towards the east was, in that narrative, an affirmation of national destiny. The war effort was shown as rational, planned, and successful. The reality of the front, with all its complexities, had not yet managed to transform that dominant narrative. But how much time could that confidence be sustained? What would happen when winter arrived and Soviet resistance hardened? From the moment the Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border, German soldiers began to face radically different conditions from those experienced in previous campaigns. The space was immeasurable, the roads impassable, and nature showed no mercy. As they advanced deeper into Soviet territory, the daily reality of the Eastern Front became more hostile. Fatigue did not accumulate with days, but with every metre travelled. The mud stuck to the boots seemed to never dry, and the uniforms, worn out by continuous use, no longer offered protection against the humidity or against the wind that cut like a knife. The mud and the cold were just the beginning. The soldiers slept in open fields or in destroyed farms, always without knowing if the next day would bring a skirmish, a bombardment, an improvised retreat, or simply more kilometres of marching towards nowhere. Provisions, planned with optimistic calculations, soon began to run scarce. Many soldiers were forced to depend on local supplies that rarely existed or had already been raised. Field kitchens could not keep up with the rhythm of the advances. The lack of food became a constant, sometimes interrupted by some theft, a barter, or a fortunate find. Letters sent home allowed glimpses of this physical deterioration, with phrases that spoke of exhausted bodies, of empty stomachs, and of days without a hot meal. In parallel, the cold penetrated everything. Blankets were not enough, and fingers froze upon contact with the steel of the weapon. In winter, breathing became painful, and frozen helmets burned the scalp. In those extreme circumstances, exhaustion was no longer just physical. It became a mental fog that hindered decisions, that made every gesture slow. Sleeping was transformed into a rare luxury, interrupted by distant gunshots, alarms, or simply by the anxiety that kept the body alert. The routine was pierced by the fear that never completely disappeared. Even when the front seemed calm, the fear of an ambush, a mine, a sniper, or a sudden offensive hovered over every step. Security did not exist. Some wrote that the most agonizing moments were the silent ones, because they anticipated the unpredictable. Constant tension wore down even the most experienced soldiers, who recognized in their diaries that the Eastern Front was something completely different from what they had lived in other campaigns. Official propaganda tried to sustain morale with heroic tales, images of smiling soldiers, and optimistic communiques. In German newspapers and newsreels, reports spoke of successful advances, of cities taken, and of a collapsing Soviet resistance. But those who were at the front saw something else. Destroyed cities offered no shelter or resources. Evacuated or annihilated populations left desolate landscapes. Casualties increased, and the terrain, far from offering control, was a field in permanent tension. Some soldiers kept pamphlets with motivating phrases that no longer said anything to them. The distance between the official narrative and the real experience became evident every day. Even so, many did not allow themselves to doubt openly. They clung to what they knew, repeated phrases of their officers, believed in the final victory as a psychological refuge more than as a strategic certainty. Family letters played a crucial role, since receiving news from home was one of the few consolations available. Those messages, although brief, managed to suspend the sensation of abandonment, but even in them, soldiers began to filter their disenchantment through veiled phrases that avoided censorship, although they transmitted with clarity the emotional burden of the front. Some spoke of the difficult life here, of endless nights, or of a land without end, while others, more explicit, confessed their fear, their frustration over the conditions, or their incomprehension faced with the slowness of the advance. Shared experiences between comrades were also ambivalent. While strong bonds were built, tensions also arose. Fatigue generated arguments, friction, despair, and not everyone resisted equally. Some fell into alcohol when there was any, others into isolation or erratic conduct. Although formal discipline was maintained, the command already noted the symptoms of an army that, although operative, began to show signs of profound wear. Geographical distance also became evident in communication with the High Command. Orders arrived late or were contradictory, and on occasions were based on inaccurate maps or outdated assumptions. The reality of the terrain belied the reports from Berlin. The enemy that should have collapsed in a few weeks kept fighting. Soviet units reorganized, counterattacked, and forced positions to retreat, and every new attempt to advance demanded more resources, more energy, and more lives. The initial enthusiasm that had accompanied the start of the operation had completely vanished. Euphoria gave way to exhaustion, and the feeling of invincibility was no longer a topic of conversation. In its place, an accepted resignation of the harshness of the Eastern Front settled in, marked by a routine based more on endurance than on the expectation of immediate success. In that context, some sought refuge in personal beliefs, in rituals, or in superstitions. They crossed their fingers before going on patrol, repeated phrases before sleeping, or carried amulets and family photos hidden in their pockets as a way of feeling less alone and keeping some control amidst generalized disorder. Emotional distance with the rearguard also increased. What was lived at the front was difficult to explain, even difficult to accept. Some soldiers began to feel that no one, except their companions, could understand what they were going through. That feeling of isolation deepened with every week. Expectations of a rapid return had vanished. They no longer spoke of returning with precise dates, but with phrases like, "when this ends," or "if we get out of this." Time became an elastic concept. The days were all the same, and watches seemed not to advance. Only the seasons marked a change, and sometimes not even that. Some soldiers documented their experiences in personal diaries, hidden among clothes or luggage. And those writings, sometimes brief and other times more extensive, offered a more intimate and raw look at what was happening. They spoke of the fear of sleeping, of wounded comrades they couldn't manage to evacuate, of marches that lasted more than 12 hours without rest. Reflections, doubts, and long silences interrupted by phrases like, "this is not what we imagined," also appeared, although few dared to say it out loud, because the weight of discipline, propaganda, and ideological mandate remained present. Even so, the fracture between the image of the front projected in Berlin and what was really being lived was increasingly evident for those who were there. Life on the Eastern Front could not be compared with any other previous experience of the Wehrmacht, for it was an environment that slowly eroded the will and put to the test the physical and psychological endurance of each individual. In that immense and hostile landscape, where the enemy was not only the other army, but also the climate, the mud, the disease, and the loneliness, German soldiers kept advancing because they had no other option left. But inside Germany was there also resistance? Were there Germans willing to defy the regime from within, risking their own lives? Since the early years of the Nazi regime, there were individuals and groups who, although isolated, began to manifest their doubts or rejection towards the imposed policies. Some did it silently, avoiding showing loyalty in public. Others dared to express contrary opinions in private circles. As the war advanced, those dispersed gestures took new forms, and although in the minority, they gave rise to pockets of opposition that could not be ignored by authorities. Among the most active sectors were young students, intellectuals, and members of the church. In universities, small nuclei emerged that analysed the situation of the country with a critical spirit. One of the best known was the White Rose Group, made up mainly of students from Munich like Hans and Sophie Scholl. Those youths drafted and distributed pamphlets in which they questioned the atrocities committed, especially on the Eastern Front, and appealed to the moral conscience of citizens to resist the regime. They did not propose an armed revolution, but an ethical awakening of conscience. The state's reaction was immediate and brutal. They were arrested, interrogated, and condemned to death in summary trials. In parallel, other youths without university affiliation expressed their discontent from the street. The so-called Edelweiss Pirates, youth groups that rejected party discipline and compulsory indoctrination, began to organize clandestine meetings, broadcast prohibited songs, and sabotage activities of the Hitler Youth. They were not articulated in a formal structure, nor did they intend to overthrow the regime, but their mere existence represented a challenge to imposed uniformity. Some of their members were arrested, others executed without process. The Church also offered spaces of dissent, although limited. Both Catholic and Protestant sectors tried to maintain certain doctrinal independence. In some cases, religious figures spoke out against forced euthanasia or racial persecutions. The Catholic bishop Clemens von Galen, for example, pronounced sermons in which he openly criticized the murders of the disabled. Although he was not arrested, many of his collaborators were, and the Gestapo closely followed his activities. Within military ranks, there were also elements who began to doubt the direction the country was taking. Some officers, disillusioned with the course of the war or scandalized by the crimes witnessed in occupied territories, began to conspire in secret. Those concerns ended up crystallizing into the most ambitious and organized attempt to eliminate Hitler, the attack of July 20th, 1944. Led by Klaus von Stauffenberg, an army colonel, the plan consisted of placing a bomb in the Führer's headquarters, eliminating the party leadership and establishing a government that would seek to negotiate peace. The operation was carefully designed and counted on the participation of numerous high-ranking military men. The device exploded as planned, but Hitler survived with minor injuries. The coup collapsed in a matter of hours. The regime's response was immediate. Massive arrests were ordered, and purges were implemented within the army and civil administration. More than 5,000 people were detained, many without direct relation to the attack. Executions followed one another without interruption. Some were hanged with piano wire, others decapitated, and many judged in processes that were in reality mere formalities. Images of the trials were filmed and used as a tool of intimidation. Repression was not directed solely against the authors of the attack, but also extended to their relatives, friends, and collaborators, whether they were real or simply suspects, applying the principle of collective responsibility. If an individual was accused of treason, their immediate circle could also be punished under a logic that sought to eradicate any possible future outbreak of dissent. The message was direct. There would be no tolerance for the slightest gesture of opposition within German society. Perception of these acts was not uniform, since a significant part of the population, influenced by propaganda and subjected to strict censorship, accepted the official version that presented the conspirators as traitors and cowards. Public speeches were delivered in which absolute fidelity to the Führer was exalted and exemplary punishment was demanded. Nevertheless, in certain sectors, especially among those who directly suffered the consequences of the war, doubts began to arise. Some saw in these acts a desperate expression, while others interpreted them as proof that not everyone shared the course the country had taken. The regime's propaganda reacted by adapting itself. On the one hand, it reinforced the image of national unity and unbreakable loyalty, presenting Hitler as the victim of a conspiracy of traitors. On the other hand, it intensified the discourse against internal enemies, comparing opponents to saboteurs and spies. Posters were distributed, public events were organized, and campaigns were launched to denounce any suspicious conduct. Surveillance became omnipresent. At the same time, the experience of the attack had effects on the inner circle of power itself. Hitler, profoundly affected by what happened, increased his distrust. He distanced himself even more from his advisors, reorganized his security team, and ordered new protocols to prevent any similar attempt. His relationship with the Wehrmacht became more tense. The competencies of the SS increased, and control bodies multiplied. The memory of those who dared to resist, from the student who handed out pamphlets to the military man who risked his life in an impossible conspiracy, remained fragmented during the conflict. Some were immediately forgotten. Others were presented as traitors for years. Only much later, after the collapse of the regime, did they begin to be recognized as symbols of a conscience that, although in the minority, did not extinguish completely. Internal dissent in Nazi Germany failed to alter the course of the war, but it revealed that even under one of the most repressive regimes in history, there existed voices willing to question, defy, and resist. In the midst of fear, of absolute control, and of omnipresent propaganda, there were those who chose another path, even though they knew their decision would almost certainly lead them to death. And how did Germany manage to sustain its war machine for so many years? What economic transformations permitted feeding the war, even when the territory began to shrink? When the conflict intensified on all fronts, and the possibility of a successful lightning war disappeared, the Third Reich was forced to completely transform its economic structure. As the scope of the war expanded, the need for a systematic mobilization of all resources became unavoidable. The regime had maintained an ambiguous policy during the first years, avoiding deep interferences in the civil economy. However, the failure to rapidly crush the Soviet Union and the entry of the United States into the conflict in 1941 forced a drastic turn. This transformation culminated in the total war policy that deployed with force starting in 1943, when the German productive apparatus was completely subordinated to the war needs of the state. The person in charge of driving this reorganization was Albert Speer, designated Minister of Armaments after the death of Fritz Todt. Although he was not an engineer by traditional training, his closeness to Hitler, his administrative capacity, and his willingness to centralize decisions made him the face of the regime's technical efficiency. Under his direction, profound reforms were implemented. Industries began to work in close coordination with the state apparatus. Business hierarchies adapted to the logic of military production. Technical commissions were created. The use of raw materials was optimized, and duplications in weapon design were eliminated. Speer established regional armament offices supervised by his personal representatives, which allowed taking rapid decisions without interference from traditional bureaucrats. Statistics began to show a notable increase in the production of tanks, airplanes, and munitions, even under constant bombardments. From 1943, propaganda promoted the Speer miracle as a demonstration of the German capacity to resist and respond with efficacy. The increase in production, however, could not be sustained solely with German manual labor. Total war demanded additional human resources. The system increasingly resorted to the massive use of forced laborers, mostly proceeding from occupied territories. These prisoners, civilians or deportees, were brought by the millions to perform tasks in factories, mines, and infrastructure works. Some were prisoners of war captured in previous campaigns. Others were civilians selected in roundups in Poland, Ukraine, France, and other countries. They were transferred in precarious conditions, housed in barracks close to industrial complexes, guarded by armed personnel, and subjected to exhausting journeys. The difference in treatment with German workers was absolute. Punishments were frequent, and control was exercised without contemplations. The survival of these laborers depended not only on their performance, but also on the arbitrariness of the supervisors. Despite the conditions, the regime justified their presence as a patriotic necessity, deliberately hiding the repressive dimension of the system. Within the country itself, the German population was also progressively absorbed by the logic of total war. The recruitment of males left broad labour vacuums that were covered with the massive entry of women into the industrial world. Although the regime had maintained a traditionalist discourse regarding the female role, the pressure of the war forced it to flexibilize that stance. Starting in 1943, public campaigns were promoted to encourage women to participate in armament production. Technical courses were offered, factories were adapted, schedules compatible with domestic life were established. Some production units installed dining halls and daycares. This mobilization was presented as a joint effort for victory. Magazines illustrated women in work uniforms next to tanks or airplanes. Although many conservative sectors were suspicious of these changes, the machinery of the state admitted no opposition when it came to sustaining the war effort. Control over civil life became almost absolute, with decisions about the destiny of each citizen taken directly from the central offices of the Reich. Trades were assigned according to productive criteria, and labour mobility was restricted to avoid regional imbalances. As unions had disappeared since before the conflict, there existed no margin whatsoever for negotiations or protests. It was the state that organised work conditions, established the workday, distributed rations and authorised permits. Meanwhile, factories remained active day and night, under a system of rotating shifts justified by the need of the common objective. This entire process was backed by the propaganda apparatus that disseminated the idea of a national community in arms, presenting the worker as a combatant of the home front. Radio stations transmitted reports on production advances, and newspapers celebrated manufacturing figures as if they were military victories. In that context, any deviation from the collective effort was immediately denounced as sabotage or treason. The impact of this transformation was profound. Cities were filled with posters exhorting sacrifice. Offices reorganized to respond to strategic needs. Children were instructed in principles of productive discipline. Schools broadcast examples of technical effort, and youths were sent to factories or farms as part of their patriotic formation. It was not just about an economy at the service of the war, but about a complete culture of work under total state control. This organization was presented as superior to the liberal one, accused of being dispersed and chaotic. The German model, according to official rhetoric, demonstrated that discipline could convert even the most difficult times into moments of growth and order. Albert Speer was portrayed as the symbol of this capacity. In his public appearances, he appeared with blueprints, charts, and workers behind him, speaking of practical solutions. He did not wear a military uniform nor use ideological language, which increased his credibility as a technician at the service of the Führer. Hitler mentioned him as an example of the new generation of German leaders capable of uniting efficiency and loyalty. This model of a technical minister was contrasted with traditional bureaucrats and reinforced the idea of a dynamic government adapted to the demands of the conflict. With the passing of time, however, the demands increased. Stricter rationing systems were implemented, displacements within the country were regulated, private celebrations restricted, and leisure culture subordinated to that of sacrifice. Shows considered frivolous were prohibited. Cinema had to exalt national resilience, and light music was displaced by patriotic marches and choirs. Churches, although they maintained their activity, were called to back the collective effort, with messages of unity and commitment. The system left no empty spaces. Every sphere of life had to serve the same objective: sustain the war at any cost. The intensive use of forced labour and the total mobilisation of internal resources allowed the German economy to maintain its production level, even when the course of the war turned adverse. This paradox was utilised by propaganda as proof that the nation remained strong. Suffering was represented as inevitable but heroic. The idea of resistance replaced that of rapid victory. Technical figures were more important than territorial conquests, and the Reich showed itself as a great cohesive machine. Armament production reached records, and that was enough to affirm that the cause remained alive. The discourse changed, but control intensified. Every German, inside or outside a factory, had to assume their role without hesitating. Thus, total war transformed the Reich not only in its economy, but in its entire social fabric. But what would happen when that industrial effort began to face an unsustainable military reality? When would the breaking point arrive that would demonstrate that no production could save a lost war? The defeat at Stalingrad, confirmed in January 1943, marked a line that divided the before and the after of the war for Germany. It was not only about a catastrophic military loss, but about a profound emotional break, both in the ranks of the army and in the general mood of the people. The weeks that followed were marked by a silence that was not habitual in the official discourse. War dispatches no longer spoke of victories, and the word Stalingrad took time to appear in the mouths of high officials. The retreat that initiated at that point was not only territorial, but also psychological, penetrating all layers of the state apparatus and into the civilian population that for the first time began to look towards the future with a mixture of fear and resignation. Perception within the army modified rapidly. Until then, many officers trusted in the German capacity to resolve difficult situations, but with the surrender of the Sixth Army, that certainty crumbled. Internal reports of the command began to show signs of bewilderment. There was concern about the enemy's reaction capacity, about the growing pressure on other fronts, and about the impossibility of maintaining a sustained initiative. Communications between commands allowed glimpsing a loss of confidence in the central strategy. Some voices even began to question decisions of the high command that until that moment were not publicly doubted. What was previously perceived as a complicated but manageable campaign transformed into a chain of defensive movements with little margin of control. In the rearguard, signs of retreat became gradually more visible. Evacuation orders for occupied territories, restructuring of battered units, and the lack of sufficient reinforcements began to generate a change in the narrative. Images of German columns retreating along muddy roads, often without air protection, became common scenes. Soldiers were no longer seen as conquerors, but as survivors doing everything possible to stay on their feet. Casualties increased, and with them also increased the pressure on intermediate commands, who had to respond to situations for which they were not prepared. German initiative had evaporated, and the adversary now dictated the rhythm of events. At the level of political leadership, the impact of Stalingrad was devastating. The absolute confidence that Hitler projected began to erode. Although in public he maintained his unbreakable discourse, in private he became more irritable, more distrustful, and less receptive to external opinions. The command structure became even more rigid. Suggestions were rejected, losses were minimized, and own capacities were exaggerated. Some generals noted that the decision center no longer responded to realistic evaluations, but to a distorted vision of the situation. Meetings became tense, and mentioning critical aspects was avoided for fear of being disauthorized. Meanwhile, the propagandistic apparatus kept trying to give an appearance of firmness, but the fissures were already too evident, even within the most loyal circles. Official propaganda initially tried to cover up the disaster. They spoke of brave sacrifices, of defense until the last moment, of unbreakable fidelity to the Führer. But with the passing of days, the tales of prisoners, and foreign news that arrived through uncontrolled media made it impossible to maintain the veil. Foreign shortwave stations gained listeners. Families who did not receive news of their disappeared sons at the front began to fear the worst. Rumors about what occurred in Stalingrad grew without control, and many no longer trusted the official figures. In factories and in neighborhoods, the name of the Russian city became synonymous with catastrophe. It was the first time that the word defeat began to take real shape in the mind of the German people. Civil society experienced a turn in its perception of the conflict. Years before, victory speeches were followed with enthusiasm. Now they were received with skepticism. Lines at stores lengthened, mail arrived with delay, and anxiety became ever more palpable. Conversations changed tone. Some still repeated official phrases, but many began to speak in a low voice about a possible unfavorable outcome. Censorship continued operating, but in private spaces they already talked about how the war could be lost. Some kept trusting that there would be a sudden turn. Others, more realistic, began to prepare themselves mentally for what seemed inevitable. In that context, expressions of passive resistance emerged. They were not organized gestures, nor was it about articulated political movements. Rather, they were individual reactions: lack of enthusiasm at work, disinterest in official campaigns, evasion of public speeches. The pressure of the environment remained present, but increasingly there were more who sought a way to express their disagreement without exposing themselves to direct reprisals. Military retreat combined with a growing loss of confidence in the leadership. It was perceived that decisions no longer responded to rational criteria, but to the obstinacy of a leadership disconnected from reality. Attempts to reinforce morale through speeches, awards, and parades resulted increasingly less effective. Even some party officials recognized in private that the initial spirit had extinguished. Promises of rapid victory no longer convinced, and the question that began to float in the air was how to resist, not how to conquer. Officers at the front, just like workers in the rear guard, noticed the wear. The energy that had characterized the early years transformed into a mixture of exhaustion, resignation, and fear. In that scenario, German society underwent a silent transformation. No open rupture or massive outbreak occurred, but rather a profound change in the way everyday life was lived. Obedience became more mechanical, expressions of enthusiasm more forced, and the following of orders more automatic. People kept fulfilling their duties, but without the conviction of before. And what happened in German cities, while the front moved further away every time? How did the civilian population live the horror that descended from the sky every night? As the war tilted clearly against Germany, cities began to feel with greater force the weight of Allied air attacks, which from 1943 onwards became increasingly frequent, intense, and devastating. Nights ceased to be spaces of rest to become moments of constant anguish, with sirens that sounded incessantly, shelters full of entire families, and explosions that made everything shake in their path. At dawn, streets resulted unrecognizable. Where there had been buildings, only smoking ruins remained. Businesses were reduced to rubble, and homes turned into craters. Human losses were counted by the thousands. Services collapsed. Water and electricity supply disappeared. Food became scarce, and fear installed itself as a permanent presence. It was no longer solely about material destruction, but about a continuous blow to the morale of a population that began to assume that defeat was not only possible but inevitable and increasingly closer. Meanwhile, the regime tried to sustain control through increasingly desperate measures, organizing the Volkssturm, a defense force composed of males too old or too young for regular service. They received rushed training, outdated weaponry, and impossible missions against an enemy that advanced with decision. In the streets, teenagers were seen with improvised uniforms, elders armed with obsolete rifles, and women who no longer just took care of the home, but also of civil defense tasks. Schools closed to function as logistical centers, plazas transformed into distribution points for weapons and food, and instructions changed constantly, while each neighborhood tried to resist with the little it possessed. Propaganda kept repeating the promise of a final victory, but the majority of the population no longer believed in those messages. Official language spoke of counter-offensives, although what was lived was a succession of retreats, destruction, and deaths. The arrival of the Red Army from the east was feared as the prelude to definitive collapse, and the news that circulated spoke of razed towns, brutal reprisals, and unrestrained vengeance. In Berlin, Soviet cannons were heard clearly while bombardments intensified without rest, and the capital, which for years had been a symbol of power and pride, transformed into a besieged city with no escape. Streets filled with improvised trenches, buildings turned into semi-destroyed fortresses, and underground shelters became shared tombs. While the population tried to survive without knowing whether to fear projectiles, crossfire, or their own commanders more, who kept executing without contemplations those they considered cowards or saboteurs. The outcome of the regime arrived without speeches or ceremonies, barely as a final decision taken in an underground bunker, while everything crumbled on the surface. The news spread amid chaos, without details or official confirmations, and it did not provoke surprise or shock, but rather an absolute silence that for many was simply the realization that everything had ended. There were no longer coherent structures of command, nor plan nor possible direction, and the only thing that persisted was a sensation of emptiness faced with the inevitable. The capitulation was signed a few days later. While the last pockets of resistance fell and the still active soldiers laid down their weapons. Thus concluded the war for Germany. What remained was a country reduced to ruins. Cities were piles of rubble, communications were interrupted, factories destroyed, and families dispersed. Survivors wandered among the remains looking for something to eat, something to drink, or simply someone they recognized. Hospitals could not cope, schools were closed, there was no transport or services, just smoke in the air, silence in the streets, and abandoned bodies everywhere. The state had ceased to exist. Authority no longer operated, and each person tried to conserve the little they had left, without time to reflect, barely with the impulse to stay alive one more day. From the German perspective, the Second World War was a collective experience that transformed everything known. It began with the promise of restoring national greatness and ended with cities converted into lunar landscapes. It started with triumphal parades in Paris and concluded with armed children defending the ruins of Berlin. Between those two extremes, millions lived the war from the inside, in factories that did not stop, on fronts that seemed never to end, in shelters where they hoped the next bomb would fall somewhere else. The official narrative that accompanied those years changed constantly. At first, everything was victory, speed, technical superiority, and inevitable destiny. Maps showed conquered territories with a rapidity that amazed the world. Newsreels transmitted images of smiling soldiers in foreign countries. Speeches promised a new order, a future free of past humiliations. Then the first signs of resistance arrived. The British sky did not surrender. The Eastern Front did not collapse as expected. The numbers began to change direction. They no longer spoke of captured prisoners, but of surrounded divisions. They no longer showed advance, but consolidation. Rapid victory was no longer promised, but prolonged resistance. Finally, the official tale remained reduced to a desperate whisper that spoke of secret weapons, of technical miracles, of enemies that would be stopped before arriving. But none of that happened. Allied armies entered from the west, Soviets from the east, and the Reich that proclaimed itself eternal lasted barely 12 years. From the inside, the experience was more complex than any simplified narrative. There were those who believed until the end. There were those who stopped believing but continued because they had no other option left. There were those who dared to resist and paid with their lives. There were those who simply tried to survive day after day, without completely understanding what was happening or why. Soldiers on the Eastern Front wrote letters that never reached their destinations. Women in factories worked endless shifts under roofs that could disappear at any moment. Children grew up in a world where sirens formed part of the routine. Elders watched everything they had known disappear. The war from the German perspective was not a single story, but millions of individual stories pierced by the same context. A regime that promised greatness and delivered ashes. A system that demanded total sacrifice and left nothing in return. A machinery that mobilized all the resources of a nation and led it to the most absolute collapse. The bombed cities became symbols of that collapse. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Munich. Names that previously evoked culture, history, tradition, became associated with massive destruction. There, populations that survived emerged from shelters to find that their neighborhoods no longer existed. The streets they had walked all their lives were now paths among rubble. The buildings where they had worked, the churches where they had prayed, the schools where they had studied. Everything had disappeared. The scale of the devastation was such that it was difficult to process. It was not about isolated damages that could be repaired, but about a systematic destruction that had erased entire parts of cities. Basic services stopped functioning. There was no running water, nor electricity, nor gas. Public transport had ceased. Communications were cut. In that context, survival became the sole priority. People looked for water from contaminated sources, food in destroyed warehouses, refuge in flooded basements. Black markets formed where goods were exchanged for other goods. Because money had lost all value, a watch could be traded for bread, a blanket for coal. Any object that could help pass one more day acquired a value that it previously did not possess. Families tried to reunite in the midst of chaos. Many did not know if their loved ones were still alive. Lists of missing persons were endless. Improvised information centres, filled with people looking for names, describing faces, asking if anyone had seen so-and-so. Answers rarely arrived. The German population faced, in addition, another type of crisis, the identity crisis. For years they had been told they were superior, that their system was invincible, that their destiny was to dominate. Now they found themselves defeated, occupied, judged. Allied forces took control of the territory, dividing the country into zones. Each zone answered to a different power: United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union. Conditions varied depending on the zone, but in all of them there was a common element. The regime that had ruled for more than a decade had completely disappeared. Party structures were dismantled, symbols were prohibited, leaders were arrested or had fled. Those who remained faced trials. The denazification process began almost immediately. It sought to eliminate any trace of the previous regime, identify the responsible ones, and re-educate the population. The Allies distributed questionnaires where every adult German had to detail their participation in the party, in affiliated organizations, in the war. The answers determined their immediate future: if they could work, if they would be judged, if they would be considered accomplices. This process generated diverse reactions. Some accepted it as necessary. Others perceived it as unjust, arguing they had been dragged by circumstances beyond their control. The majority simply wanted to turn the page and rebuild their lives. But turning the page was not simple when the consequences of the war were everywhere. The Nuremberg trials became the symbol of justice applied to the leaders of the regime. For the first time in history, high officials of a defeated government were judged for crimes against humanity. Sessions were transmitted, documented, filmed. The world watched while details were revealed about concentration camps, massive executions, medical experiments, systematic looting. For many Germans, those trials were a shock. Some claimed to have known nothing. Others recognized having heard rumors, but not having believed them. Still others admitted having suspected but having preferred not to ask. The magnitude of the revealed crimes forced every individual to confront their own role, however passive it might have been. The memory of the war became a complex and painful topic. The generations that lived it kept long silences. They did not want to speak of what occurred. They did not want to remember. They did not want to transmit. This silence extended for decades, creating a gap between those who had lived those years and those who were born later. Rebuilding Germany was not just a physical matter. Bridges, factories, housing, roads had to be rebuilt. But trust, institutions, collective identity also had to be rebuilt. This process took years, even decades. The country remained divided for almost half a century, each half following different paths, developing distinct systems, constructing their own narratives about the shared past. The war, from the German perspective, ended with a brutal lesson: that propaganda can convince millions, that obedience can lead to the abyss, that the speed of a conquest does not guarantee its permanence, and that the cost of following a criminal regime is paid with entire generations. What began with promises of greatness ended with a divided nation, destroyed cities, and millions of lives lost or shattered. This tale does not seek to justify, but to understand how an entire society could be mobilized towards war, how the illusion of victory was sustained even when everything indicated the contrary, how it was lived day by day in the midst of a conflict that consumed everything. The German perspective of the Second World War is the story of a country that bet everything on a distorted vision of the world and lost not only the war, but also its own soul. What really happened in the minds of those who designed every military operation? How did the German command apparatus function when victories transformed into defeats? The command structure of the Wehrmacht was complex, and, as the war advanced, it became increasingly dysfunctional. During the early years, there existed certain fluidity between the different branches. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command of the Armed Forces, coordinated general operations under the direct supervision of Hitler. But each military branch maintained its own general staff, the Oberkommando des Heeres for the army, the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe for aviation, and the Oberkommando der Marine for the navy. This division generated constant tensions, resources were limited, and each branch competed to obtain priority. The Luftwaffe, backed by the personal influence of Göring, frequently obtained more allocations than its performance justified. The Kriegsmarine, in contrast, operated with severe budgetary restrictions, especially after the failure of Plan Z and the impossibility of developing a competitive surface fleet. The ground army, being the most numerous force deployed on the broadest fronts, constantly faced logistical problems that central planners underestimated. Maps in Berlin showed clear lines and ordered movements. The reality on the ground was completely different. Destroyed roads, blown bridges, broken down vehicles without spare parts, units separated from their supply lines. During the early years, these problems were resolved through improvisation and the capacity of local commands to adapt. German officers received training in what was known as Auftragstaktik, a command system based on general objectives rather than on detailed instructions. It was expected that every commander understood the global intention of the operation and took autonomous decisions to fulfill their mission. This method worked well when advances were rapid and the enemy was disorganized. It permitted taking advantage of unexpected opportunities, reacting to sudden changes, and maintaining offensive momentum without waiting for orders from above. However, when the war became defensive and circumstances turned desperate, this system began to collapse. Hitler, who initially had left certain autonomy to his generals, began to intervene ever more in operational decisions. After the failure of the offensive in Moscow in the winter of 1941, he personally assumed direct command of the ground army, displacing military professionals. From that moment on, strategic decisions came to depend increasingly on his personal will. Meetings at headquarters turned into long and exhausting sessions, where Hitler dominated the conversation. Generals presented reports, but their recommendations were frequently ignored or rejected. If a commander insisted on a tactical retreat to avoid the encirclement of his forces, Hitler accused him of defeatism. If another suggested redistributing resources to reinforce a weakened sector, he was told that there were no additional resources and that he must comply with what was assigned. This rigidity had direct consequences on the battlefield. On multiple occasions, German units remained trapped because they were ordered to maintain unsustainable positions. Stalingrad was the most dramatic example, but it was not the only one. On the Eastern Front, there were numerous fortresses declared by express order of Hitler, cities that had to be defended until the last cartridge without possibility of retreat. Some of these fortresses managed to resist temporarily, but at an immense human and material cost. Others simply fell after prolonged sieges, with garrisons captured or annihilated. The doctrine of not one step back prevented elastic defensive maneuvers that would have allowed conserving forces for subsequent counterattacks. Generals who dared to disobey direct orders faced severe consequences. Some were dismissed and sent back to Germany. Others were publicly degraded. After the attack of July 1944, any form of dissent within the military command became practically impossible. Personal loyalty to the Führer became the principal criterion, above professional competence. But how did these decisions of the High Command translate into the daily experience of the common soldiers? What did it really mean to be at the front when orders came from Berlin, but reality was completely different? The experience of the German soldier varied enormously depending on the front, the moment of the war, and the unit to which they belonged. During the victorious campaigns of 1939 and 1940, many soldiers lived the war as a succession of rapid advances, conquered cities, without major combats, and a sensation of participating in historic events. Letters from that era reflect enthusiasm, pride, and confidence. They mention distances covered, landscapes seen, populations traversed. Some soldiers bought postcards in occupied cities and sent them home as souvenirs. Others photographed monuments, squares, landscapes. The war seemed a controlled adventure. That perception changed radically with the campaign in the Soviet Union. From the first weeks, it became clear that this front was different. Distances were overwhelming. Roads, when they existed, were dirt and became impassable with the rain. Towns were small, poor, and had frequently been evacuated or destroyed by the retreating Soviets themselves. German soldiers expected to find populations that would receive them as liberators from communism. In some regions, especially in the Baltic countries and in western Ukraine, there were sectors of the population that initially viewed the German arrival with some relief. But that attitude changed rapidly when brutal occupation policies, forced requisitions, massive executions, and derogatory treatment towards the local population began. Soldiers witnessed these acts. Some participated directly. Others were passive witnesses. Few opposed openly. Letters from this stage begin to show discomfort, doubts, unanswered questions. Some write about things they do not understand, about orders they find difficult to fulfill, about situations that perturb them. Military censorship reviewed all correspondence, eliminating explicit references to military operations, specific locations, or any comment that could be considered defeatist. But between the lines, messages transmitted a change of mood. They no longer spoke of near victory. They spoke of resisting, of enduring, of surviving until things improved. The winter of 1941 marked another turning point. German soldiers were not equipped for the extreme temperatures of the Russian winter. Winter uniforms had been prepared, but they did not arrive on time or in sufficient quantities. Soldiers improvised protection with whatever they found: newspapers inside boots, blankets stolen from houses, civilian clothes over uniforms. The cold caused more casualties than combats in some sectors. Frostbite affected thousands. Fingers, toes, ears and noses were the most vulnerable zones. Severe cases required amputations. Field hospitals filled with soldiers with necrosed limbs. Infections spread in precarious sanitary conditions. Vehicles stopped working. Oil froze. Batteries lost charge. Cooling systems cracked. Tanks became immobilized. Artillery could not be moved. Supply transport collapsed. Units depended on what they carried with them, and when that ran out, they had to make do with local resources that rarely existed. In that context, morale dropped drastically. Soldiers began to question in private if they really could win the war. Propaganda kept speaking of victories, but they saw retreats. They were told that the enemy was on the verge of collapse, but every day they faced more organized and fierce counterattacks. The brutality of the Eastern Front also left profound psychological marks. Combats were fierce, with no quarter. Prisoners were frequently executed by both sides. Reprisals against civilians were common. German soldiers knew that if they fell prisoner to the Red Army, their chances of surviving were minimal. This knowledge generated a dynamic of escalated violence. If you knew surrender meant probable death, you fought until the end. If you knew the enemy gave no quarter, neither did you. If you saw that your unit executed prisoners, you assumed the enemy would do the same. The cycle fed itself. Soldiers developed psychological survival mechanisms. Some became cynical, assuming nothing mattered except making it to the next day. Others clung to routines and superstitions. There were those who carried lucky charms, prayed before every combat, or avoided certain behaviors they believed brought bad luck. Bonds between comrades strengthened until they became the only reliable support network. Your squad, your platoon, your company. Those were the ones keeping you alive. You shared food, watched each other sleep, covered their mistakes, rescued the wounded. Trench solidarity became stronger than any ideology. But that solidarity also facilitated participation in acts that individually many would have rejected. When your unit received orders to execute prisoners or civilians, resisting meant isolating yourself from your companions, exposing yourself to accusations of cowardice or treason, and facing severe punishments. Peer pressure and the command structure made any form of individual objection extremely difficult. How many German soldiers participated directly in war crimes? How many were passive witnesses? How many really knew nothing? These questions continued to be debated. The Wehrmacht was not a criminal organization in the formal legal sense, like the SS was, but neither was it a clean institution that simply fulfilled conventional military functions. There were units of the regular army that actively participated in massive executions, especially on the Eastern Front. There were commanders who issued illegal orders. There were soldiers who committed atrocities on their own initiative. There were also soldiers who limited themselves to fulfilling strictly military functions, who did not participate in crimes, who even in some cases tried to protect civilians. The institution was large and diverse enough to harbour highly varied behaviours, but the general context was one of an ideological war of annihilation, especially in the East, where norms of international law were systematically violated. Soldiers wrote about these topics with extreme caution. Some wrote nothing at all, others used euphemisms or vague phrases. The letters that survived show a broad range of attitudes, from ideological enthusiasm to moral horror, passing through resigned indifference. After the war, during interrogations and trials, many soldiers claimed to have followed orders without questioning, to have been in wrong places at wrong times, or simply not to have known what was occurring. These claims are difficult to verify decades later. What is clear is that the war in the East was much more brutal than the campaigns in the West, and that this brutality was not only the responsibility of special units, but permeated regular military operations. And what role did technology play in all this? Was Germany really technically superior? Or was that also part of the propagandistic myth? The narrative of German technical superiority is one of the most persistent myths about the Second World War. It has partial basis in reality, but it is fundamentally exaggerated. Germany produced some innovative and effective designs, but it also had numerous technical failures, production problems, and erroneous strategic decisions in weapons development. In the field of tanks, German designs evolved throughout the war. At the beginning, the Panzer I and II were light and lightly armed, useful for reconnaissance but inadequate for heavy combat. The Panzer III and IV formed the backbone of the armoured divisions during the victorious campaigns, being balanced, reliable designs produced in reasonable quantities. However, the encounter with Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks in 1941 was a technical shock. The T-34 combined sloped armour, mobility on difficult terrain, powerful armament, and ease of production. It was superior in many aspects to contemporary German tanks. This revelation forced a German reaction that resulted in the development of the Panther and the Tiger. The Tiger I, introduced in 1942, was formidable in direct combat. Its 88mm cannon could destroy any Allied tank at distances where they could not respond. Its frontal armour was almost impenetrable for standard projectiles, but it was extremely expensive to produce, consumed fuel in enormous quantities, was mechanically complex and prone to breakdowns, and required constant maintenance. Only around 1,300 units of the Tiger I were produced during the entire war. In contrast, the Soviet Union produced more than 80,000 T-34s. The United States manufactured almost 50,000 Shermans. The individual superiority of the Tiger was irrelevant when it faced overwhelming numerical disadvantages. The Panther, designed as a direct response to the T-34, tried to combine the best of both approaches. It had sloped armour, a powerful 75mm long barrel cannon, and better mobility than the Tiger. But its first version suffered severe mechanical problems. Engines overheated and caught fire. Transmissions failed. The interleaved wheels jammed with mud and froze in winter. These problems were resolved in later versions, but the Panther never reached the reliability of the Sherman or the T-34. Furthermore, its production was slower and costlier. When it was finally being produced in significant quantities, Germany had already lost the strategic initiative and could not replace losses at the necessary rate. Towards the end of the war, the regime kept developing ever heavier and more complex tanks. The Tiger II, or King Tiger, was even more powerful and armoured than its predecessor, but also heavier, slower, more prone to breakdowns and harder to transport. Fewer than 500 units were produced. Designs like the Maus, a super heavy that reached 180 tons, never made it past prototypes. This obsession with ever larger tanks reflected a deeper problem: the inability to accept that the war was one with numbers, logistics, and massive industrial production, not with individual superweapons. The resources invested in producing one Tiger II could have produced 3 or 4 Panzer IVs, which, although less impressive individually, would have been more strategically useful. In aviation, the story was similar. The Luftwaffe began the war with effective fighters, like the Bf-109 and the Fw-190. Both were competitive with the best enemy designs. But as the war advanced, the Allies developed superior models, like the P-51 Mustang, the improved Spitfire, and the Soviet Yak-3. German bombers were mostly medium designs, adequate for tactical support but inadequate for deep strategic bombing. Germany never developed an effective long-range heavy bomber comparable to the B-17, Lancaster, or B-29. Attempts, like the HE-177, were plagued by technical problems. Instead, resources were invested in more exotic projects. The Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was technically impressive. It flew much faster than any piston engine fighter, but it arrived too late, in insufficient quantities, with reliability problems, shortages of fuel and trained pilots, and at a moment when the Luftwaffe had already lost the battle for air control. Hitler also insisted that the Me-262 be used as a fast bomber instead of an interceptor, which reduced its effectiveness. By the time its mass use as a fighter was permitted, the war was almost lost. Around 1,400 units were produced, but only a fraction ever entered combat. The secret weapons projects, the Wunderwaffen, consumed enormous resources with minimal results. The V-1 and V-2, flying bombs and ballistic rockets, caused damage in England but did not alter the course of the war. They were extremely costly in relation to their effectiveness. A V-2 required thousands of hours of slave labour, scarce components and precious fuel to deliver an explosive charge smaller than a conventional bomber. The V-2 program consumed resources equivalent to those needed to produce thousands of combat airplanes. From a purely military perspective, it was a colossal waste, but it had propagandistic value and fit Hitler's vision of revolutionary weapons that would change the course of the conflict in a magical way. And what about the naval war? How did German submariners live their own version of the war? The German submarine war, the U-boot campaign in the Atlantic, was one of the few fronts where Germany was close to achieving a decisive strategic success. If the submarines had managed to cut the supply lines between the United States and Great Britain, British capacity to continue the war would have been severely compromised. During the early years, especially in 1940 and 1941, the U-boots managed to sink enormous amounts of Allied tonnage. German submariners called this period the happy time because Allied defences were weak and targets abundant. Convoys crossed the Atlantic with little protection. Submarines operated in wolf packs, attacking at night on the surface where they were difficult to detect. Life aboard a U-boot was extremely harsh. Submarines of the era were small, narrow, and lacked basic comforts. The crew lived in confined spaces for weeks or months. There were no showers. The air was humid and stale. It smelled of diesel fuel, oil, sweat and urine. Submariners slept in shifts in narrow bunks. The space was so limited that some had to sleep among the torpedoes. Food at the start of the patrol was fresh, but deteriorated rapidly. Towards the end, they subsisted on canned goods and mouldy bread. Drinking water was strictly rationed. Attacks were moments of extreme tension. The submarine approached the convoy, launched torpedoes, and then had to escape from escorts responding with depth charges. These underwater explosions violently shook the hull. Lights flickered or went out. Pipes burst. Sailors waited in silence, not knowing if the next explosion would break the hull and drown them all. The casualty rates among German submariners were the highest of any military branch. Of the approximately 40,000 who served in U-boots during the war, around 30,000 died, a mortality rate of 75%. They knew their chances of surviving were minimal, but they continued, some out of duty, others for camaraderie, many simply because they had no choice left. The submarine campaign reached its peak in 1942, but then began to decline. The Allies improved their anti-submarine tactics, introduced new technologies like centimetric radar and improved sonar, increased the number of escorts, and deployed long-range aviation that covered the Atlantic Gap, where submarines previously operated freely. By 1943, U-boot losses increased dramatically, while their successes diminished. Admiral Dönitz, commander of the submarine fleet, had to temporarily withdraw submarines from the North Atlantic. When they returned, equipped with new devices like the Schnorr shell that allowed running diesel engines submerged, it was already too late. The Allies dominated the sea. The final years of the submarine war were a prolonged agony. Submarines went out on increasingly dangerous patrols with increasingly lower chances of success. Many were sunk before reaching their operational areas. Others spent weeks without finding targets. Those that attacked faced formidable defences. The letters of submariners reflect a growing fatalism. They knew they probably would not return. Some wrote explicit farewells before every patrol. Others simply stopped writing, assuming there was no sense in maintaining false hopes. And how was life in the rearguard while all this occurred? What did families experiencing waiting for news of their loved ones at the fronts experience? Daily life in Germany during the war went through several distinct phases. The first years, up to 1942 approximately, were relatively tolerable for the civilian population. There was rationing, but no severe shortages. Military victories kept morale high. Allied bombings were still limited and focused on industrial and military targets. Women took on increasingly more responsibilities. With men mobilized, they had to maintain households, raise children, work in factories, and comply with the demands of the state. Party organizations, especially the League of German Girls and the National Socialist Women's Organization, mobilized millions in tasks supporting the war. Collections of metal, warm clothing for soldiers, recyclable materials were organized. Campaigns for saving and self-sufficiency were promoted. Urban gardens became vegetable patches to supplement rations. Families learned to cook with substitutes, chicory coffee, synthetic butter, bread with alternative flours. Children grew up in an environment of constant propaganda and militarization. From a young age, they were integrated into youth organizations where ideology, discipline and preparation to serve the state were instilled in them. Childhood games imitated combats. Toys were little soldiers, tanks and airplanes. The stories they heard glorified sacrifice and loyalty. As the war prolonged, the impact on the rearguard intensified. News from the front became less frequent or vaguer. Casualty lists lengthened. More and more families received telegrams informing them that their son, husband, father or brother had fallen in combat, was missing or had been captured. The ritual of mourning became common. Windows with black curtains signalled homes in mourning. Women dressed in black for months. Children grew up without fathers. Wives became young widows with children to feed and without stable incomes. The state offered minimal pensions, but many families fell into economic hardships. Allied bombings intensified dramatically from 1943. What were previously occasional incursions became systematic campaigns of destruction. British bombers attacked at night, razing entire neighborhoods with incendiary bombs. Americans bombed by day, aiming at factories and infrastructure, but also causing enormous civilian casualties. Cities developed survival routines. When sirens sounded, the population had minutes to reach shelters. These were reinforced basements, public bunkers, or adapted subway stations. Families learned to prepare emergency backpacks with documents, medicines, water, and basic food, ready to grab and run. Nights in the shelters were long and agonizing. Hundreds of people crammed into dark, damp, and poorly ventilated spaces. Children cried, adults prayed, or remained in tense silence. The sound of explosions drew closer or further away. Walls shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Nobody knew if upon exiting they would find their house standing or reduced to rubble. Incendiary attacks were especially devastating. Incendiary bombs created firestorms that consumed entire neighborhoods. Temperatures reached such high levels that asphalt melted. Air was sucked towards the fire, creating hurricane-force winds that dragged people. Shelters became ovens, where people died, asphyxiated, or burned, without the flames touching them directly. Hamburg, in July 1943, experienced the first massive firestorm. Operation Gomorrah killed more than 40,000 civilians in 1 week. Dresden, in February 1945, suffered an attack that caused tens of thousands of deaths. These figures were comparable to those of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but caused with conventional weaponry. The German civilian population paid an enormous price for the war their government had initiated, but this did not automatically generate opposition to the regime. Some blamed the Allies for attacking civilians. Others kept trusting in promises of secret weapons that would change the course of the war. Many simply focused on surviving one more day, without mental energy for political questions. The system of social control was maintained even under bombings. The Gestapo kept operating, arresting those who made defeatist comments, listened to foreign broadcasts, or showed any sign of dissent. Neighbors denounced neighbors. Children repeated at school things they heard at home. Distrust permeated social relations. Towards the end of the war, the situation became apocalyptic. Cities were fields of ruins. Basic services had collapsed. Rationing was insufficient even on paper, and in practice many products simply did not exist. The black market flourished, but at prices only the desperate or well-connected could pay. Columns of refugees began to arrive from the east, fleeing the Soviet advance. They brought stories of violence, looting, and reprisals. Fear of the Red Army became omnipresent. Families who could try to evacuate towards the west, preferring to fall under American or British occupation than Soviet. And how did the German population react when the full magnitude of the regime's crimes was finally revealed? What did they feel upon discovering what had been done in their name? This is perhaps one of the most complex and painful questions in German history. The answer is not single or simple, because reactions were highly varied, and because the truth was revealed gradually, not all at once. During the war, the German population knew that something terrible was happening to Jews and other persecuted groups. They had seen the deportations. They had seen their neighbors disappear. They had seen the discriminatory laws, the confiscations, the public humiliations, but the majority did not know the specific details of the extermination camps. The Holocaust was executed with a certain degree of secrecy. Extermination camps were located in occupied territories, far from Germany proper. The language used was euphemistic, final solution, special treatment, evacuation to the east. The most explicit documents had limited distribution, but the secrecy was not absolute. Soldiers who had been in the east had seen things. Some participated in massive executions. Others were witnesses, and many, on leave or in letters, commented on these experiences, although frequently in a veiled or minimized way. Workers in certain industries knew they employed slave labor from the camps. Inhabitants of towns near concentration camps saw the trains arrive, saw the chimneys, smelled the smoke. There was enough information circulating for anyone who wanted to know to be able to infer that something monstrous was occurring. But the majority chose not to inquire too much. It was easier, safer, more comfortable not to ask difficult questions. Propaganda had systematically dehumanized the victims. Jews were presented as existential enemies, as conspirators against Germany, as responsible for all national misfortunes. This ideological preparation facilitated indifference. When the camps were liberated by Allied troops in 1945, the visual evidence was undeniable. Images of piles of corpses, of skeletal survivors, of gas chambers and crematorium ovens were documented in photographs and films. The Allies forced German populations near the camps to visit them, to see directly what had occurred. Reactions were diverse. Some expressed genuine shock, claiming they had known nothing. Others tried to minimize their knowledge or responsibility. Many took refuge in the argument that they had been deceived by the regime, that they had been victims of propaganda, that they could not have done anything. This attitude of collective denial extended for years. In immediate post-war Germany, there was little room for historical reflection. The population was focused on basic survival, finding food, rebuilding homes, locating dispersed relatives. Accusations of complicity were rejected as unjust or as enemy propaganda. The process of confronting the past was slow and painful. It took decades. The first post-war generations frequently avoided talking about the subject. Parents did not tell their children what they had done during the war. Children learned not to ask. An implicit pact of silence was created. It was not until the 60s and 70s, when a new generation began to demand answers, that a more honest confrontation with the past occurred. Trials of war criminals that continued for decades kept the topic in the public consciousness. German historians began to exhaustively investigate the Nazi period. Education was transformed to ensure that new generations knew in detail what occurred. Visiting a concentration camp became a standard part of the school curriculum. Museums, memorials, and documentaries proliferated. Germany officially assumed responsibility for the crimes committed. But even today, more than 70 years later, questions about collective guilt, individual responsibility, and the nature of consent under dictatorship continue to be debated. To what extent was the population guilty? How much responsibility falls on those who were just following orders? What real alternatives existed for those who dissented? These are not abstract historical questions. They are moral questions that every society must confront about its own capacity for evil, about the limits of obedience, about personal responsibility in context of extreme collective pressure. And what happened immediately after the surrender? What was the first day of peace like after almost 6 years of total war? The day the weapons finally fell silent, May 8th, 1945, brought no celebrations in Germany. There were no multitudes partying in the streets like in London, Paris, or New York. In German cities reigned a strange, disturbing, almost surreal silence. People slowly emerged from the shelters, from the basements, from the rubble where they had spent the last weeks or months. They looked around and saw unrecognizable landscapes. Entire cities had been reduced to mountains of rubble. The buildings that still remained standing were perforated by projectiles, burned, without windows or doors. There was no electricity. There was no running water. There was no gas. Telephone lines were cut, roads blocked by rubble, bridges blown up, train stations destroyed. The entire country was a disaster zone. Survivors wandered like ghosts among the ruins. They looked for missing relatives. They looked for personal objects among the rubble of what had been their homes. They looked for food, water, anything that could help them survive one more day. Bodies kept appearing, in the streets, in collapsed buildings, in parks turned into improvised cemeteries. The smell of death permeated the air. Local authorities, when they existed, organized burial brigades. Corpses were piled into carts or vans and transported to mass graves. Allied occupation troops took control. American, British, French, and Soviet soldiers encountered a defeated, starving, and traumatized population. In the Western zones, troops generally treated civilians correctly, although with harshness. Curfews were imposed. Gatherings were prohibited. Checkpoints were established. In the Soviet zone, the situation was much worse. The Red Army arrived with a thirst for vengeance. They had traversed their own country, destroyed by the Germans. They had seen burned villages, executed civilians, enslaved compatriots. Now they exacted every atrocity with interest. Rapes were massive and systematic. It is estimated that around 2 million German women were raped by Soviet soldiers. No distinction was made between ages. Girls, adult women, elderly women, all were vulnerable. Rapes occurred publicly, in groups, repeatedly. Looting was also extensive. Soviet soldiers confiscated anything of value: watches, radios, bicycles, clothing, furniture. Houses were systematically emptied. Factories were dismantled piece by piece and sent to the Soviet Union as war reparations. Deportations began almost immediately. Hundreds of thousands of Germans were sent to labor camps in the Soviet Union. They would work for years in mines, construction, industry, in brutal conditions. Many would never return. German prisoners of war faced varied destinies depending on where they had been captured. Those who fell into Western hands were generally treated according to the Geneva Convention, although initial conditions were harsh due to the lack of resources. Those who fell into Soviet hands faced years of captivity in appalling conditions. Of the approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by the Soviets, around a third died in captivity. They suffered hunger, diseases, exhausting forced labor, and arbitrary punishments. The last prisoners did not return until the mid-50s, a decade after the end of the war. Germany's borders were redrawn. Eastern territories, East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, were handed over to Poland and the Soviet Union. The German population of those regions, millions of people, was expelled. This was the largest forced population transfer in modern European history. Refugees arrived in what remained of Germany, with only the clothes on their backs. They had fled or been expelled, leaving behind generations of family history, properties, ancestral tombs. Many had suffered violence on the way. They arrived traumatized, dispossessed, without hope. Ruined cities had to absorb this human avalanche. There was no housing. There was no work. There was barely any food. Refugee camps were improvised. Entire families lived in barracks, in abandoned train cars, in semi-destroyed basements. Diseases spread: tuberculosis, dysentery, typhus. The winter of 1945 to 1946 was especially brutal. It was one of the coldest of the century. Without fuel for heating, without glass in the windows, without adequate clothing, thousands died of cold and malnutrition. It was called the Hunger Winter, the Winter of Hunger. Official rations were insufficient to maintain life. They hovered around 1,000 calories daily, less than half of what was necessary to work. People lost weight until they were unrecognizable. Children suffered severe malnutrition, with effects on their development that would mark them for life. The black market became the only real way to obtain sufficient food, but it required something to exchange. Those who possessed valuable objects, jewelry, fine porcelain, watches, could obtain food. Those who had nothing were at the mercy of charity or luck. American cigarettes became the de facto currency. A pack of cigarettes was worth more than money. With cigarettes, one could buy anything: food, clothing, services. Allied soldiers, especially Americans, distributed cigarettes or sold them, creating a parallel economy. Women, desperate to feed their children, sometimes resorted to exchanging sex for food. Relationships with occupying soldiers were frequent, some out of genuine affection, many out of economic necessity. These women were stigmatized as Armeeliebchen or Russenliebchen, a derogatory term that mixed moral contempt with envy for their access to resources. In this context of total collapse, the denazification process was initiated. Allied authorities distributed questionnaires, Fragebogen, that every German adult had to complete. Hundreds of questions about their labor history, political affiliations, membership in organizations, participation in party activities. Based on the answers, people were classified into categories: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, exonerated. Consequences range from prohibition to work in certain fields to criminal trial. The process was clumsy, frequently unjust, easily manipulable through false testimonies. Many ex-Nazis simplified their past or hid it completely. They obtained denazification certificates through bribes, connections, or mutual testimonies, where former party members testified to the innocence of others. The system quickly became cynical, known sarcastically as washing machines, where Nazis were cleansed en masse. Simultaneously, the Nuremberg trials began. The surviving leaders of the regime faced accusations of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The trials were exhaustively documented, establishing a legal and historical record of the Nazi regime. Sessions were broadcast, photographed, filmed. The accused attempted diverse defenses: denial, claims of ignorance, obedience to superior orders, military necessity. Few worked. Of the 24 principal defendants, 12 were sentenced to death. 7 received prison, 3 were acquitted. Executions were carried out in October 1946. Goering committed suicide the night before with a cyanide capsule he had managed to hide. The rest were hanged. Their bodies were cremated and their ashes dispersed in secret to prevent their tombs from becoming places of pilgrimage. The trials continued for years, processing thousands of lower-ranking war criminals, concentration camp commanders, SS officers, doctors who performed experiments, bureaucrats who organized deportations. Many were condemned, but many more managed to escape, hide their past, or received lenient sentences. For the common German population, these trials were viewed with mixed feelings. Some considered them necessary justice. Others saw them as victor's justice. Many were simply too busy surviving to pay attention. The division of Germany formalized progressively. Occupation zones consolidated. Differences between the Western and Soviet occupation widened. In the West, a market economy began to be rebuilt. In the East, a socialist system of central planning was implemented. Berlin, although located entirely within the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4 sectors. This would create growing tensions that would culminate in the blockade of Berlin in 1948 and the construction of the wall in 1961. But that is already another story, the story of the Cold War. How could a nation recover from such a catastrophe? What allowed Germany, from those complete ruins, to rebuild itself until becoming an economic power once again? The answer is complex and has multiple factors. In the short term, foreign aid was crucial. The Marshall Plan, implemented since 1948, injected billions of dollars into the reconstruction of Western Europe, including West Germany. This investment financed infrastructure, industry, housing. But money alone did not explain the recovery. The work ethic of the population also influenced it. After the initial trauma, Germans focused on rebuilding with an almost obsessive determination. Volunteer brigades were formed that cleaned rubble brick by brick. The women of the rubble, Trümmerfrauen, became the symbol of this era. They worked with their hands, without machinery, cleaning, saving reusable materials, clearing land for new construction. It was hard, dirty work, poorly paid when it was paid. But it was done because it needed to be done. Cities could not be rebuilt until the rubble was removed. The monetary reform of 1948 in the Western zones was another turning point. The old Reichsmark, inflated and worthless, was replaced by the Deutsche Mark. Suddenly, money meant something again. Stores that had been empty filled with goods that merchants had hoarded waiting for a stable currency. The economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, of the 50s transformed West Germany. The economy grew at extraordinary rates. Unemployment fell, salaries rose, stores filled with products. People could buy household appliances, cars, travel on vacation. This prosperity had material bases, rebuilt industry, foreign investment, access to international markets. But it also had a psychological dimension. The focus on economic growth allowed avoiding confronting the recent past. If we look forward towards the prosperous future, we didn't have to look backward at the shameful past. East Germany followed a different path. Under Soviet control, it adopted a planned economy system. Reconstruction was slower, living conditions more austere, liberties more restricted. Many East Germans tried to flee to the West, provoking the regime to build the Berlin Wall to stop the hemorrhage of population. For decades, the two Germanys represented opposing systems, contrary ideologies, different visions of the future, but both shared a common past that weighed upon them. Reunification in 1990 would once again raise questions about national identity, historical memory, and collective responsibility. Today, Germany is frequently pointed out as an example of how a nation can honestly confront its past, assume responsibility, and build upon that foundation. But that process was neither immediate nor easy. It took generations. It required moral courage, intellectual honesty, and political will. Education about the Holocaust and the Nazi period is exhaustive in German schools. Memory sites proliferate. Memorials remember the victims. Legislation penalizes Holocaust denial and the exhibition of Nazi symbols. The country has publicly, officially, accepted its historical responsibility. This does not mean that the topic is closed or that it no longer generates controversy. Every generation must rediscover and reinterpret that past. Debates about how to remember, what to emphasize, how to balance memory and future continue. But the basic commitment to facing historical truth is maintained. The history of the Second World War from the German perspective is a warning about the dangers of extreme nationalism, demagoguery, authoritarianism, and the dehumanization of the other. It shows how entire societies can be mobilized towards destructive objectives, how propaganda can distort the perception of reality, how blind obedience can lead to massive crimes. It is also a story about individual and collective responsibility, about the choices we make when we face extreme pressure, about the ease with which moral principles can be abandoned under difficult circumstances, about the importance of maintaining critical capacity, even when the entire system pushes in the opposite direction. Not all Germans were convinced Nazis. Not all participated actively in crimes. But the majority was complicit through their silence, their indifference, their willingness to benefit from the system while looking the other way regarding its criminal aspects. This passive complicity was what made the regime possible. The victims of Nazism were millions: Jews, Romani, homosexuals, disabled people, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, civilians of occupied countries. Their voices, their stories, their interrupted lives must be remembered. The German perspective does not replace nor minimize those stories, but understanding it helps to understand how such a catastrophe was possible. Because the danger has not disappeared. The elements that made Nazism possible, fear of the other, search for scapegoats, promises of national greatness, demonization of internal and external enemies, distrust in democratic institutions, remain present in all societies. Being vigilant against those dangers requires knowing history. It requires education, critical thinking, empathy, willingness to defend principles even when it is uncomfortable. It requires recognizing in ourselves the capacity for evil, not as an excuse, but as a warning. The war scene from Germany was not a saga of glory, nor a narrative of innocent deceived victims. It was a complex experience where millions participated, consented, or were dragged by a system that promised greatness and delivered destruction. It was a catastrophe that began with nationalist promises and ended with a divided country, cities in ruins, and a moral stain that took generations to begin to clean. To understand that perspective, with all its contradictions, is not to justify. It is to understand the complexity of human history, the fragility of civilization, and the ease with which it can collapse when fundamental principles of humanity, justice, and compassion are abandoned. The soldiers on the Eastern Front who wrote about endless nights and desolate landscapes, the women in the factories who worked double shifts while waiting for news of their husbands, the children who grew up among sirens and explosions, the elders who saw the world they knew disappear, the dissidents who risked everything to resist, the prisoners of war who survived years of captivity, the refugees who lost everything, the survivors who emerged from the ruins with the impossible task of rebuilding. All these experiences formed part of the German perspective of the war. No single individual story captures it completely. Taken together, they form a mosaic of suffering, complicity, resistance, survival, and finally, reconstruction that defines one of the darkest chapters of modern history. This was the Second World War from the German perspective, a nation that bet everything on a distorted vision of the world, that mobilized every resource towards conquest, that committed unprecedented crimes, that was defeated in an absolute manner, that faced the consequences of its acts, and that had to learn, painfully, the hardest lessons that history can teach. This was everything. The complete history of how a country lived the war it unleashed, from the initial euphoria to the final collapse, from the triumphal parades to the smoking ruins, from the absolute confidence in victory to the acceptance of total defeat. A necessary perspective to understand not only what occurred, but how it was possible and what lessons we must extract for the future. If this journey made you reflect, if it helped you to better understand one of the most complex periods of modern history, share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect impacted you the most? What part of this history was the most revealing to you? What questions do you still have? The conversation about this past does not end here. It continues in every generation that must rediscover, reinterpret, and learn from these events.